Hey everybody, welcome to Identity Radicals. I'm Mike Towers. I'm the Chief Security and Trust Officer here at Veza, and today I'm joined by longtime friend and fellow security leader Adam Fletcher, who's the Chief Security Officer at Blackstone. Adam, great to have you here, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mike. Always good to chat with another security leader and swap stories, share perspectives.
Awesome. Yeah, Adam, I thought that what we could talk about today, it's actually something that I think you and I have spoken about a few times over the years, but let's talk a little about something that I think, frankly, is giving CISOs headaches pretty consistently. Something that I call the posture of access. Some of our peers or colleagues call it the three pillars of least privilege. I know, Adam, you and I have talked about all sorts of models and all sorts of concepts around this, but just we'll start off a little bit of a background, or at least setting this up a little bit. In your experience, how are organizations tackling the question of who can, who has, and who should take what action on what data?
Well, not well, probably. I think everyone's dealing with it. It's a complex issue. I think as we've all started our transition to the cloud, whether that is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, whether you've gone full cloud native or you're still in a hybrid environment. We talk about the fact that there's no perimeter anymore, right? The perimeter, in fact, if anything, is identity. And I think that we're starting to put together this concept that it's going to be less about tracking hosts and tracking IPs and moving traffic inside of an environment, and more about where did that identity go? And when the attacker compromised this identity as the first one, what else did they have access to? And should that person have had that access? And were they using that access? And what's the blast radius of an identity? And investigations are going to follow these identities more so than in the past, when they followed endpoint to endpoint across an environment. So I think it's very important to have a single source of truth here, to be able to put all of that together and understand what your exposure might be.
Yeah, great points. Thanks for that, Adam. And I've absolutely seen organizations struggle with this as well. I guess one of the first things that you hear people talk about, and I think you and I have actually acted upon, is it all starts with visibility. What do you think about starting with visibility, and how are you approaching that challenge?
Well, I think we've approached it for several years, first from the perspective of compliance, right? We are a regulated organization. We have Sarbanes-Oxley to contend with. So for that reason, we have had a procedure for access reviews, or entitlement reviews in place for several years. And that, whether it was a manual process, whether it was something, you're fond of saying that the CAS process, the kick-ass spreadsheets process,
Yep.
Or, now, using Veza, understanding, who has access to what, and whether they still need that access, and reviewing and certifying that access biannually. That's an important part of our framework, now, and has been for several years. But I would say that, when you think about that more as a security paradigm and less as a compliance, initiative, right? You have to expand beyond just those applications that are relevant to financial reporting. And you really have to work towards all applications. And especially now, where we've transitioned to these cloud environments, and we have software as a service where we've chosen to take our confidential data and put it into the hands of a third party. We really have to start asking, are we doing our part of the shared responsibility model, and are we ensuring that the right people have the right access to that data, especially when it's held outside of our four walls?
Yeah, it's such a great point, and I think you hit it head on there. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, the word I like to use a lot, is variability. There's just so many sources. There's so much places our data can move to, whether it's the cloud, whether it's data, whether it's SaaS. Heck, most companies still have a pretty significant on-premise environment as well. So, and it's really, really important to have a unified view as well. And that's obviously, as you know, something that Veza prides itself on, is that we built our platform on one of the fundamental and foundational elements of trying to make sense of all this variability and having some sort of a unified view. But one of the criticisms I get a lot, Adam, and I don't need to see what I already know, or I don't need another tool that tells me that I know how hard this job is. Don't give me a bunch of stuff that I can't fix. So I'm curious what you think. Once you have this visibility, how do you start actually implementing least privilege?
Well, I think that part of it really comes down to, understanding who has what access, and then kind of using automation and using the technology that's available, to try and distill that, into either roles or groups, or, some sort of least privilege type cohort, and then work from there. And one of the things that, I hope to, start layering on top of that, is, well, what access are they actually using? Right. I think, if you can start to understand, what access should people get as part of, day one, meaning their role or title in the organization, the office they work in, the business group that they work in, whatever defines that day one access, permission. Then you combine that with day two access, meaning, they started on their first project and they talked to their friends that they were assigned to work with, and all their friends said, well, you need access to this too. So they requested it and it got approved by a manager, and now they have day two access. And then you layer that, on with the access that they're actually using over time, and you start to say, well, this is the access that this person needs, right? It was defined by their role, it was requested because of their, assignments, and it's something that they're using. And if you can correlate all of that information, I think that's how you get to, an automated version of least privilege. If, the platform that you're using has the ability to start to either recommend or automatically take away, access that isn't being used.
Yeah, it's automation certainly is important here. And I've had similar conversations with other peers and other security leaders. And if you think for a minute about, these circles that we talk about and some of the other areas of security, or this access posture, if you will, there's obviously, it's one thing to know who can take certain actions, who has certain access. But one of the tricky ones, I think, is who should. So what should the access be? Determining who should have access. What do you think, or how are you handling that?
I think that's a collaborative effort. I think you need to engage, different business units, business leaders, application owners. I think that on the one hand, you always strive for least privilege to be the minimum amount of access that's required to do your job. But on the other hand, I think as security leaders, we also should be striving for least friction, and to make sure that we understand, that over permissioning could be a risk, but it also reduces friction. So the question becomes, whether, like, how does a security team, how does an identity and access management team evaluate when the risk of over permissioning is one that could result in a data breach or an incident, and when is it really not that big of a deal, but it reduces friction, on certain people. And you can only really make that determination in collaboration with the owners of the data and the owners of the information, right? Most often, security teams are not really in a position to make a decision like that. So you have to collaborate with the owners of the data or the owners of the applications, to get there.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting point, because I know one of the things that we've been thinking about from a longer term perspective is recognizing and understanding that as hard as identity teams may work and as hard as central security teams may work, and as much of this collaboration that exists, expecting one team to centrally understand all of this may end up being a challenge, could end up being a bottleneck, et cetera. So to your point, understanding and working with the business and recognizing that at some point they have to step up and make their own role. The shared responsibility model that we have with cloud partners, you could argue, is also transcending to a shared responsibility model between us in a central security function in the business, so that they can have their active role and play their part here. Because to your point, they understand the data, they understand the systems, they understand how the business processes can and should work to allow that to happen. I think it's really, really important. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about enabling the business, but also recognize, you talked before, which was a really, really good point, about sometimes this starts with compliance. And compliance for many companies and many businesses, especially regulated industries, is table stakes. But it's obviously something that doesn't go away, and it's constantly evolving. So with all this stuff that we've been talking about, all these changes, how do we still maintain and manage the compliance across all these complexities?
Well, I think, for one, it's always interesting to think the compliance universe is really a subset of the bigger universe of access and entitlements, right? It's unlikely that, all of your applications, have a compliance, requirement associated with them. So, I think what's interesting is most people often use the compliance requirement to establish the pattern that they can then use, to evaluate what else should be onboarded into, let's say, an access review process, or a least privilege automation process, or an automated provisioning and deprovisioning process based on, some set of criteria, that makes rational and logical sense to people. So in our case, right, as I mentioned, we obviously have SOX as the starting point, right? So the applications that are relevant to financial reporting, for us as a public company, those are the ones that we start with. Those are essentially the highest risk applications, because of the compliance obligation, and then we go from there, and we have, a risk ranking based on, different criteria, such as how critical is the application, how confidential is the data that's held in the application, other things that, generate effectively a risk score. And then from there, we can decide which applications to continue onboarding into, our automation, our access reviews, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and some of these compliance requirements, some like SOX have been around for a while, others like data privacy continue to evolve, and I think the regulatory landscape is always evolving. So when we think about everything that we've talked about so far, and we're still being challenged with implementing least privilege, especially across hybrid environments, what do you see are the biggest challenges in implementing least privilege?
I mean, other than just scale, like size and complexity, I think that it's also the difference between entitlement structures, right? I think we probably started off, before cloud, before SaaS, we kind of started off in a world where, entitlement structures were fairly simple. And that's why legacy IGA platforms were able to use relational databases, right? But now we live in a world where there's hundreds of SaaS platforms that we're all using, and everybody has their own entitlement structure, right? And so if you're trying to create linkages across millions, of entitlements across hundreds of platforms, you simply can't do that with the rigid structure that a relational database, is built upon. Like, you just don't know what the entitlement structures are going to be in advance, and you can't use that model. So, that's why it's important. It was important for us to pick a platform that used a graph database, to build the relationships between the entitlements across, hundreds of applications, so that we could understand that a user, had entitlements in all of these places, and here's what the relationships looked like. I think that's really, the only way that you get that pervasive visibility, and that you can start to develop actionable insights at scale, across your entire identity universe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The scale, complexity, and the variability is daunting. And when I think about, doing this as long as you and I have, I think about how many advancements there's been with things like single sign-on, SSO, MFA, which of course are critically important, and there's standards in place that you could allow, from a user experience perspective. For example, most companies have deployed some type of SSO and some type of central enforcement point for multi-factor authentication, but there are standards like FIDO and SAML that allow that to happen. To your point, there's no equivalent standard in the permission side. So all of these platforms have different taxonomies, different structures, different nested groups, different nested roles. Some of them have a very, very simple structure, some are very complex, but none of them are the same. So the variability is really, really important and to understand. And to your point, building a platform and having a platform that from the ground up recognizes that scale is going to be the number one challenge is frankly something that resonates with us, what we're seeing here at Veza, because we need the ability to aggregate all the data and do it in a way that allows us to drive action as well, and make these types of decisions and these types of insights something that can drive action, and not only drive action from a central security team, but also drive action from, say, a business leader or a manager, giving the right level of data and the right level of intelligence to make informed decisions. So yeah, definitely all of those contributors are making this, and it's one of those things where I've often said and reflected on the fact that when I think about, as CISOs, we have all of these controls we have responsibility for. But so many of those controls and so many of those areas have changed. So I remember the days when everybody would be given a standard laptop so you could have unified control on the desktop, or maybe everybody was connecting to a network, which no longer applies because everybody's remote and there's so many different variables in where people work from. But nothing will ever change the fact that identities need access to data. So this problem isn't going anywhere. And it's only going to get bigger and more broad and more challenging the more cloud we have. So everything you said is deeply applicable to some of the foundational assumptions that we've taken here at Veza. And I think it's really, really important for CISOs across to understand how important this challenge is and how much of a priority it should be. So I guess we'll kind of like bring this into the home stretch here, Adam. What are any of these discussions that we've talked about, what are some final thoughts that you'd have for our listeners who are grappling with these challenges?
Yeah, I think the first step is visibility, and I think that's especially true when you start to think about the data lakes, the data warehouses, the SaaS platforms where we have put our data. I don't know that it's true in every organization, but I know several organizations, where the security team that is in theory responsible for protecting the organization against a data breach, is actually not the team that manages the onboarding and permissioning and, ongoing access recertification of the SaaS applications, data lakes, data warehouses where the data is actually sitting. That might be a data science team or a data analytics team or someone, and so I think there's a lot of trust and very little verify in situations like that. And so if you don't have visibility as a security team right? How are you going to verify that, you have least privilege, that, the permission structures are what they should be, and that the risk of over permissioning, is one that, you're either managing, or you can live with based on, your organization's risk tolerance, right? So I would say the first step, is procuring, a tool or a platform that provides that visibility so you can visualize whether, the entitlement structures in those applications are actually respecting, the security policies, the compliance policies, the standards that you as a security organization have set in place for your organization. Because if you don't have that visibility, right, then you're basically relying on hope. And I think we all know that hope is not a viable strategy, especially in the security space. So I think once you get that visibility, then you focus on, automation, you focus on automated provisioning and deprovisioning, you focus on, the access intelligence that enables you to reduce privilege. Here we call it, a culture of access removal, right? Like, let's look at what people are doing. Let's look at what people are using. Let's look at what they have access to, and let's try and reduce that, to the minimum that's required without introducing too much friction into their daily lives. And if you can get to that with automation, then you can start, the continuous monitoring aspect of it, and kind of stay in that, green zone, as you continue to manage these applications. And last, I would say, don't forget the human element here, right? I think that security is everyone's responsibility, not just the CISO and the security team's responsibility. So this is where, you need to educate, your employees that security is part of their job. You need to educate, your business leaders that, you're not the owner of the data. You're not the one who bought the application, right? Like, they need to be partners, in the kind of the internal shared responsibility model of ensuring that the organization's data is protected, on an ongoing basis. So, you've got to build those relationships. You've got to partner with them. You've got to have, equal say in how it's being done. And that sets security up to be collaborative, and a responsible part, of protecting the organization's data along with, those business partners.
Yeah, it's such a great point. It's such great advice. I think that, it's funny. I was in an airport this morning, and I think about what so many enterprises out there do is, like I was saying before, it's front door security. Imagine a world where as soon as you got through TSA in the airport, you could get any plane you want and get any seat you wanted. That obviously wouldn't be very, very secure, and frankly wouldn't be very, very scalable, and would obviously lead to a lot of issues. But that's how a lot of companies enforce their access. They do it at the front door level, and they put a lot of scrutiny at the front door, but they don't really focus on the permissions and entitlements once you're inside. So I think and to your point about having the business involved to understand that and working on understanding those needs, I think is vital. And the last thing I think I would say, just to build on what you mentioned, is, when I look at the market, when I look at the solutions out there, I think we have to recognize that, there's not a lot of companies out there who just run SaaS or just run cloud or just run on-premise or just run data platforms. There's, this has to be a fabric. It has to tie together so many different things. And I'm not only recognizing the resources, but also recognizing the identity and everywhere in between. And you said it a few minutes ago that, no matter how many employees you may have in your company, and you think about how many quote unquote identities that means, those identities are multiplied across every platform, and it gets really, really complex really, really quickly. So Adam, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today.
My pleasure, Mike.
Thanks. And that wraps up today's episode, Identity Radicals. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, in the world of identity, radical thinking leads to radical security. To see more Identity Radicals content, please subscribe to the Identity Radicals podcast on YouTube or by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you and take care.